The number of water-related conflicts seems to be on the rise, but water has always been part of international disputes. Access to safe drinking water was first recognized as a human right by the UN over a decade ago. Restricting access to it is becoming a prominent tactic in conflicts. Today we're taking you to the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea.
The North Crimean Canal is one of the longest ones in the whole world. It's the longest in Europe.
This remoulding of the Crimean landscape really was part and parcel of the Soviet Union's social engineering.
Ukraine had to pay for this project of Soviet gigantomania.
In this episode of The Global Jigsaw, we dig into the history of the Crimean water dispute, the surprising twists and turns, and the narratives constructed by both Ukraine and Russia. I'm Krassi Twig, and this is The Global Jigsaw, an original podcast from BBC Monitoring, zooming in on political, security and social shifts around the world through the lens of its media. Our team listens to, watches and analyzes media narratives in 100 languages.
Radio Tehran. Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
The Crimean Peninsula, for many a sort of Côte d'Azur of the former Soviet Union, especially those not lucky enough to get to Sochi on the Black Sea, Vladimir Putin's favorite spot, that is. Francis Scar on our Russia team has heard a lot about it.
For ordinary Russians, Crimea has long been seen as this kind of jewel in the crown of the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union. And many Russians who were born in the Soviet era fondly look upon their holidays to the peninsula and were in fact very happy and celebrated when Crimea was annexed by Russia again in 2014.
It feels this is the perfect spot for a quick crash course in Crimean history. It has changed hands many times. Tsarist Russia annexed it the first time in the 18th century. After the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, it became part of Soviet Russia. The peninsula was transferred by decree from Russia to Ukraine in 1954, but it essentially remained within the same country, the Soviet Union. Our Ukraine specialist Sergei Arsentiev on our Kyiv team has a few fond memories of Crimean holidays.
We mostly went to the southern shore, of course, where all the resorts are. But we also had trips to the mountains and to the valley of the Chorna River, which basically feeds one of the biggest water reservoirs in the southern Crimea. And there was a so-called Spring of Youth. The feature of it was that any person jumping into it will become a teenager because he will have to jump out of it immediately because the water was so cold. It had this rejuvenating effect.
But it wasn't just the Spring of Youth that made the Kremlin want Crimea back. Moscow launched a military campaign in 2014 to annex the peninsula, although it initially denied it was behind the move. Francis has some thoughts on that.
If we're to talk about the Russian leadership and the Kremlin, arguably the greatest significance that Crimea brought was the fact that the Black Sea Fleet was based there. And in 2010, a lease was extended with the Ukrainian president of the time, Yanukovych, on the Black Sea Fleet's use of Sevastopol, the major port in Crimea, until 2042.
This move might seem odd coming from the president of independent Ukraine, but Viktor Yanukovych was backed by the Kremlin throughout his presidency. He fled to Moscow just before the annexation of Crimea.
And some commentators have even suggested that despite all of the Kremlin's rhetoric about saving Crimea, in inverted commas, from a nationalist Ukrainian government not interested in the predominantly Russian-speaking population there, Putin's chief interest in annexing the peninsula was actually to secure Russia's strategic interests and the future of the Black Sea Fleet, which he may have felt was under threat after Ukraine turned westwards towards the European Union following the Maidan revolution in 2014.
For Russia, there's always the lure of a warm water port. Vladimir Putin eventually broke his silence about the annexation and his own role in it.
And the significance of Crimea to Putin personally was demonstrated clearly in a 2015 film released by Russian state TV, in which the Russian president said that he had personally overseen the operation to annex the peninsula. And he described Crimea as Russian territory. And Putin also spoke about the moment when Ukraine had become independent following the collapse of the Soviet Union as a moment when Russia had been robbed.
Central to the water dispute we're discussing is the North Crimea Canal, part of the joint Soviet history of Ukraine and Russia.
As part of the major ambitious plans that originated with Stalin across the Soviet Union was a plan to manage the whole country's water reserves. And this extended to Crimea and to southern Ukraine, where the first dam was built on the Dnipro River.
During World War II, Ukraine, including Crimea, was under German occupation. And when the Red Army won it back in 1944, an unprecedented crackdown followed.
Stalin accused the native population of Crimea, the Tatars, of collaborating with Nazi Germany and embarked on a policy of forced deportation of this ethnic group to Central Asia. And in their place came huge numbers of ethnic Russians, completely changing the social fabric of the peninsula.
And it wasn't just the social fabric that changed with the arrival of the Russians. The Crimean Tatars had their ways to find and use water to grow food, even in dry steppe conditions.
They knew how to dig for water, how to collect rainwater, how to even collect water from water vapor in the air. They put big stones under the trees that collected water during the night, and then during the day shielded the roots from the sun. After the deportation of Tatars in 1944, the Soviet Union started resettling Russians and Ukrainians into central Crimea, and turned out that they can't live there without water. They were accustomed to growing potatoes and cabbage, so to give them water, Stalin's administration in 1950 decided to build a canal from the Dnipro River and building a dam in Nova Kakhovka.
We found curious archive footage of the works and the grand opening. Top Soviet leaders were present.
Незабываемый момент. Этого дня с нетерпением ждали в Крыму.
And as you can hear, people were jubilant as the water started running in the North Crimea Canal. But it came at a price for Ukraine.
Lots of very fertile land on both sides of the Dnipro were flooded. It was a tragedy, of course, for many people in Ukraine when those dams were built, because they had to move from those fertile lands to dry lands and then had to build irrigational canal, which didn't sound logical.
500,000 hectares of land with more than 2,000 villages went underwater. Around 3 million people had to leave their homes. The flooded area we're talking about is 4 times larger than the area which was to be irrigated as a result.
The North Crimean Canal had brought in around 85% of the peninsula's water supplies. However, only a small proportion of this was actually drinking water, and the vast majority of it was meant for the irrigation of the northern areas of Crimea, where a rice industry had developed under Soviet rule.
They even managed to grow rice there. And in some areas, they even had a problem when the soil started turning into a swamp.
Rice is a thirsty culture, so why choose rice to grow in semi-arid steppe conditions?
The Soviet economy was a planned economy, and they had to produce everything. Probably those rice plantations were supposed to replace imported rice and actually produced enough rice to satisfy the demand of entire Ukraine.
Fast forward to 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, which Ukraine and others view as the start of Russia's invasion. Kiev was at the time still supplying water to Crimea.
Ukraine didn't have access to the meters on Crimean territory, so Ukraine didn't know how much water it supplied to Crimea. And as Russia moved more and more troops to northern Crimea, they also required water to operate. It was politically wrong for Ukraine to supply water to those military units.
So Moscow found itself in a bizarre situation. To be dependent on Kiev for the water supply of Ukrainian territory it had just occupied.
Ukraine continued to supply water along the canal until April 2014, but Crimea refused to pay for that water, and after a considerable debt accumulated, Ukraine cut off water.
In the following months, the Ukrainians then built a dam which blocked off water supplies to Crimea, and the Russian side was then forced to decide how they would compensate for the loss of water supply to the region. And this is really something that hadn't been solved in the period between 2014 and 2022, when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was launched.
As we found out, the building of the North Crimea Canal was a Soviet grand design, attempting to tame the terrain to satisfy the needs of its new inhabitants. So what did the annexation by Russia change?
After Ukraine cut the water, the population of Crimea significantly changed. Right after the annexation, Ukrainian estimates are that about 100,000 Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians left the peninsula. At the same time, the number of Russian troops in Crimea increased from 12,000 to about 30,000. All those people needed water. And after Russian troops were moved to northern Crimea, one of the small rivers there just dried up.
But it was not just Moscow's army that needed water. The general population increased too, despite so many Ukrainians leaving.
According to various estimates, from 500,000 to 800,000 Russians moved to Crimea from 2014 to 2022. Russian official statistics, of course, shows only an increase of about 190,000, but that figure is most likely inaccurate.
It's believed many Russians didn't register their residence in Crimea, as it could have jeopardized their attempts to get Schengen visas because the EU didn't recognize the annexation of Crimea. And in terms of the damage to crops, the lack of water was quickly felt in semi-arid northern Crimea.
Of course, farmers lost their rice harvest in the first year, but according to Crimean reports, next year they just switched to winter crops and other drought-resistant crops.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. Now we are going into the narratives. How has Russia responded to the blocking of the North Crimea Canal by Ukraine?
We saw two differing narratives, one which was propagated domestically inside Russia and one which was promoted internationally. So inside Russia, we actually saw attempts to downplay the significance of lack of water supplies. And this is a topic which President Putin has been very reluctant to discuss publicly, which suggests that he wants ordinary Russians to think it's not a particularly large problem and one that can be solved fairly easily.
After the annexation, Russia laid power cables on the Sea of Azov to supply electricity to Crimea. They built the Crimean Bridge and road links to the peninsula. But Russia didn't manage to provide enough water for internal consumption inside Russia. The local authorities and central authorities as well kept saying that there was always enough water in Crimea.
Мы в Крыму не зависим от воды Северо-Крымского канала. Мы 8 лет прожили без нее.
If we're talking about politics, the Crimean authorities at first declared that they didn't need Ukrainian water at all. And even after the drought of 2020, Crimea refused to appeal to Ukraine for water supplies on humanitarian grounds. Ukraine said it was ready to supply water, but the request was never made. For Russia to admit that Crimea is dependent on Ukraine in something would mean that the decision to annex Crimea wasn't actually a very good one. So they never admitted that, and they never asked for water.
This was how the story was presented for domestic audiences. But how did Russia talk about the Crimean water blockade at global fora?
Russia, on international platforms, has accused Ukraine of genocide and of hypocrisy, saying that if it really cares about the people of Crimea, it wouldn't have taken this step, and that Russia was therefore within its rights to annex the peninsula in order to protect the people. And in this vein, Russia actually launched a lawsuit against the Ukrainian state with the European Court for Human Rights, although Russia failed to provide extra documents which were requested by the court, and therefore the case was adjudged by the court.
The contrast between the two narratives aimed at different years is staggering. One plays it down, the other suggests a war crime.
Under the Geneva Convention, the occupying country, Russia in this case, should provide food and water for the local population on the occupied territory. And since Russia considers Crimea its integral part, and for some reason wants Ukraine to supply power and water there, it's a standard element of Russian propaganda blaming a foreign enemy for Moscow's inability to do something, in this case, to manage Crimea properly. In Soviet times, it was the USA, the reason for all problems. Now it's Ukraine, which Russia describes as a US puppet.
The old Soviet playbook put to use here. And Francis explains why none of these legal wranglings would actually matter.
This is also complicated by the fact that international law doesn't necessarily apply to this issue, since the vast majority of the world's countries consider Crimea to be Ukrainian and therefore see it as a domestic dispute rather than an international one. The law which exists on water is enshrined in a United Nations Convention on the issue, which only came into effect in 2014. And neither Ukraine nor Russia is a signatory to this convention.
Whichever way you dress it, a disrupted water supply is a serious issue in an area prone to drought. The North Crimea Canal supplied 15% of drinking water for the peninsula's 2.5 million residents. So it's no wonder the Russians lined up a few big projects to solve it.
We've seen wells and boreholes being dug across the peninsula, and we have seen the Russian army stepping in to divert the course of the Belbek River to supply water for Sevastopol, the biggest city on the peninsula. But some of these efforts have led to additional complications, meaning that the mineral level in the aquifers in the groundwater has exceeded norms, and now extra steps have to be taken to reduce the level of minerals in the water before it can actually be drunk by the people who live there.
The only thing that the Russian authorities did was drilling water wells and using the strategic freshwater reserves of Crimea, which since Soviet times was reserved for extraordinary situations like nuclear war, if all the other water sources are contaminated.
So none of these big plans came to fruition, really.
While the peninsula was able to provide water for drinking for the people who lived there, it wasn't able to compensate the loss of water for agricultural and industrial purposes. And the major drought in 2020 showed how vulnerable Crimea was in terms of its water supplies in the face of any kind of significant disruptions.
Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022. Francis remembers vividly one of the first major acts of this new phase of the war.
It's difficult to get into the decision-making process of the Kremlin, but one thing which really sticks out in this respect is that the Russian army blew up the dam that Ukraine had built to stop water supplies reaching Crimea just 2 days into the invasion on the 26th of February in 2022. And the fact that they did this so soon after launching the full-scale invasion suggests, to me at least, that this was a key objective in attacking Ukraine.
The role of the North Crimea Canal may have been downplayed by Russia, but there are clues for its significance that we can track in the media behavior. Crimean TV channels reported live from the scene when water started filling the concrete canal bed, weeks after the full-scale invasion.
Russia presented the restoration of water supply to Crimea as the biggest victory of the invasion. The North Crimean Canal was definitely used for propaganda purposes, and it was used before the war, and it was used during the war to show how successful the Russian military operation was.
But that's not the end of the story. 16 months later, the next major act of destruction of Ukraine's water infrastructure followed. If you remember, Sergei mentioned earlier the building of a dam in the 50s, which meant villages and fertile soil were flooded. Something similar happened again in the aftermath of a disputed act of war, the breach of the Nova Kakhovka Dam in the summer of 2023.
Підірвана дамба в кількох місцях і велика вода, яка щільним потоком виливається з Каховського моря.
Some analysts said that the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam was a way of settling scores. As the disaster unfolded, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky pointed the finger straight away at Moscow, calling it an act of terrorism by Russia.
Екологічна трагедія, зроблена руками російських терористів.
The dam destruction killed a lot of people, mostly on the left bank of the Dnipro. At that time, Russia evacuated only military personnel and the locals with the Russian passports. And there were reports that Russian soldiers even prevented the evacuation of Ukrainians. And they also fired on those Ukrainians who tried to go in boats from the right bank to the left bank to save people from flooded homes. I remember a Ukrainian TV interviewed civilians who tried to evacuate people from the flooded villages, and they did it despite Russian fire. There is still no data on how many people were killed by that flood on Russia-controlled left bank because there is still a zone of hostilities.
A recent investigation by the Associated Press news agency confirmed what Sergei feared. It found that Russian occupation authorities vastly and deliberately undercounted the dead. They took control of the issuance of death certificates, not allowing access for local health workers and volunteers, threatening them when they defied orders. And what could people in Russia who get their news from state TV find out about the breach of the Kakhovka Dam?
Immediately in the wake of the incident, it was covered by some of the major talking heads on Russian state TV. For example, Dmitry Kiselyov, who hosts a 3-hour weekly news program and has been branded as Putin's chief propagandist. And in his show, a few days after the destruction of the dam, he accused Ukraine of an act of terrorism. And he talked up the dam as a masterpiece of Soviet engineering. The Russian media came out blaming Ukraine for the destruction of the dam. But what was interesting was the contradictions and the lack of clarity we saw from the Russian state media in particular. And in the hours following the destruction of the dam, the Russian appointed mayor of the nearby town of Novaya Kakhovka actually told state media that there was no problem and that everything in the town was quiet and peaceful. He then changed tune a couple of hours later to the dam had been subjected to mass shelling at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 6th of June when the dam was breached. But then we saw slightly conflicting narratives coming from Russian state media in the wake of the dam's destruction. One narrative was that there had been some kind of explosion and Ukraine was accused of blowing up the dam.
President Putin's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov calling it here a deliberate sabotage by the Ukrainian side, intended to cut off water supplies to Crimea.
But the narrative which Russian state media seemed to settle on was that this dam had been subjected to a consistent shelling or attacks by Western-supplied missiles such as the HIMARS system from the US, which had cumulatively caused the breach of the dam. Russian state media had not reported on this alleged shelling, which was supposed to have taken place over several months. And my team at BBC Monitoring looked at the coverage in the preceding months and only found a report on this alleged shelling at the end of March. So there was a period of over 2 months when the Russian state media had not felt the need to report on this.
As for Ukraine, the country that has been historically known as the breadbasket of Europe, the dam breach created a catastrophe with profound long-term consequences.
Ukrainian experts estimated that about 15% of Ukrainian grain export potential was lost. They say that there will be no irrigated agriculture there in the next decade, or probably more. And depriving Ukraine of income from grain export and increasing world food prices was one of Russia's goals from the start of the war.
There were consequences for Moscow too.
I think the ultimate outcome of the destruction of the dam is to take Crimea back to where it was in 2014, after the canal was blocked by Ukraine, meaning that Russia now has to, again, find some significant solution to Crimea's water supply issue.
And is this something that is being talked about?
It was talked about in the wake of the destruction of the dam, but again is something that has dropped off the agenda, and given that it's evidently something the Russian authorities are not keen to draw attention to. Since annexing the peninsula, the Russian authorities have promoted Crimea, knowing that it's something that boosted Putin's popularity ratings, and they do not want to portray it in any kind of negative light. They want to promote it as a positive story.
These narratives are helping to obscure a major crisis. There are only clues as to how bad the water supply situation in Crimea is. As for southern Ukraine, that is still reeling from the aftermath of the dam breach, the future of Ukrainian farming is looking bleak. Thanks to our contributors Francis Carr and Sergei Arsentiev. The researcher was Victoria Onikienko. The sound engineer is John Boland. Our editor is Judy King. This episode was produced by the Global Jigsaw team, Krista Shattery and me, Krassi Twig. We'll have another episode on water security for you soon, focusing on the waters of Helmand, dropping on your RSS feed soon.